we welcome you to a podcast on stage with enterprise thought leaders. My name is Apurva Kasam, and I'm the associate editor of On Media's B2B enterprise technology publications. We have engaging conversations with global thought leaders and industry experts. As World Backup Day approaches, it's a crucial time for enterprises to reflect on their cybersecurity practices. With advancing technologies, the threats faced by enterprises continue to evolve. We have invited Sean Deuby, Principal Technologist at Semperis, to share his insights on the importance of having robust backup strategies. Sean Deuby brings over 30 years of experience in enterprise IT and hybrid identity to his role at Semperis, an original architect and technical leader of Intel's Active Directory, Texas Instruments Windows NT Network, and a 15-time MVP alumnus. Sean has been involved with Microsoft Identity Technology since its inception. Sean, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Apula.
Yeah. So, as the World Backup Day is approaching, cybersecurity has been on top of mind for all the enterprises. And with evolving threats and increasingly sophisticated attacks, enterprise must ensure that they have robust backup strategies. So, to start off, let's talk the fundamentals, Sean. What do you think are the most effective backup strategy to ensure data integrity?
Well, I'm an identity guy, so that's what I focus on. I'm not an expert necessarily in other applications, backup strategies, but the broad principles apply. And since identity is the core of modern security, these rules are critical to backing up and recovering identity, because until you have reestablished trust and identity, the rest of it really doesn't matter, or the rest of it can't be safely brought back online and operating until you know you can trust your identity system. So we're familiar with the old 3-2-1 recommendations for backup strategies, which is to say 3 copies, 2 different types of media, and 1 offsite. And I would amend, as we talk about modern backup strategies, I would amend the third one to say immutable. Offsite is great, but immutability, the inability to change something that once it's been created, is super important. Now, for an identity system, the basics are an identity system such as Active Directory, which is what 80% of the organization uses as their foundational identity system. The basics are make sure that you have a backup for every domain in your forest, and that you have more than 1 domain controller, at least 2 domain controllers, which is a domain controller is the server that Active Directory runs on, that you have at least 2 domain controllers per forest. And that if you have a root domain in your forest, that it's critical that you make sure that you have good backups of that root domain, because if those are not good, the rest of it aren't good. And that the backup, and maybe you're using something as simple as Windows Server Backup that comes with Windows Server, the backup should be stored off server. So that's the very, very, very basics of it. And the way I look at, if you're trying to figure out what effective backup strategies you have, the way to look at it is to figure out how the threat actors that are attacking your environment go after your backups. Because it's well known now, or maybe it's not so well known, I'm trying to make it better known, that when a threat actor attacks your organization, one of the first things they do is they go after your backups. Because obviously their goal is to hold you at risk, and to do that, they have to get rid of the backups. So what that means, and what is so much of the world is right now, because I just did a post about 25 years of Active Directory. I mean, this identity system is 25 years old, which is forever in IT times. But the reality is we all still rely on it. And so one of the things that made Active Directory so popular and has given it such staying power is the fact that applications in the on-premises world are integrated into Active Directory. So you can use one account to sign in to many different things. It's enterprise single sign-on. And people forget, because it's been so long, that when enterprise single sign-on came in, that was a revolution, because before that, everybody had to sign on to different systems with different accounts. So that was a great ease of use of it and the ability for account management to be much simpler. On the flip side, that we're now experiencing is if that account is compromised, then so many of your applications have been compromised. So we're talking about backups. So coming to this point, the majority of backup systems for on-premises are AD integrated, which means you would use typically a separate account in Active Directory, an administrative account, and logging into that administrative account will give you administrative access to the backup system. Well, if you're a threat actor, that's what you go after. And then you use your administrative access to destroy the backups. So there are a couple of aspects that come out of this. Number one is for the effective backup strategies is if you haven't done it already, to disengage your backup system from relying on Active Directory accounts to log in as administrator, so that if AD is compromised, your backup systems are not automatically compromised. Another angle on this is, remember, and the way to figure out how to best protect your backups is to have somebody red team your organization, have them try to break into your environment, just the way a threat actor would. That's how you find where the vulnerabilities are. So one of them is gain control of Active Directory, gain control of the backups. Another is if they don't necessarily have to gain control of the backups themselves, if they can gain control of the infrastructure that the backups are on. Maybe it's a virtualization infrastructure. Maybe it's a storage area network. So that's another angle to think about is, maybe you've disassociated your backups from your backup administration from Active Directory. But hey, you still use Active Directory accounts to log into vCenter. Okay, let's go in and disable. Let's go disable your virtualization hosts. So that's the disassociation with Active Directory for data integrity. Another, and of course, there's immutability, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But the other, and this is an area that is wildly underserved that people don't think about, for identity systems, which is different than a web server, which is different than a file server. An identity system like Active Directory is all about data integrity, the trustworthiness of the system. And so when you're thinking of, ultimately, this is about having availability of your identity system. And implied in that availability is not just the fact that it's there, is the fact that you can trust it. If your identity system's been attacked, the threat actors do more than just put malware on a domain controller. They alter the integrity of your Active Directory. And so it's up to you to figure out what changes they have made and eject those changes so that your identity system is trustworthy again. And this is an area that, and this is World Backup Day, but this is, we're coming up on World Backup Day. But this is about data integrity and about trustworthiness. So it's not just about restoring Active Directory. It's about restoring the integrity in the service itself. And this is where you get into identity forensics, and it gets fairly complicated. But certainly the basics that I'm talking about here, the basics of backing it up, the basics of disassociation with Active Directory and immutability are some of the basics that you can do.
Thank you, Sean, for the long, beautiful answer.
Long answer.
Sean, now given that the cyber threats are evolving rapidly, so there's a concern around traditional backup methods. Do you think traditional backup methods are still not enough?
I think we go to the red team answer. What do the bad guys do?
Mhm.
And so once you know what the bad guys do, let's take the lowest common denominator, let's say Windows Server Backup. And you're using Windows Server Backup and it's backed up to the domain controller and you've not copied it anyplace else on the local server. Well, the threat actors go in and they gain control of the domain controller. They destroy the backups. Okay, get that backup someplace else for immutability. And immutability, and if you don't have a fancy backup solution, maybe you're just using Windows Server Backup. Remember, immutability can mean many things. It can mean copying it up to something in Azure or AWS that doesn't use the same credentials that Active Directory does. It could mean something is, depending on the size of your organization, it could mean something like backing it up to an external hard drive and disconnecting it from the network. What's that old phrase? There's no substitute for 6 feet of fresh air. That counts as immutable. And then, of course, the more sophisticated backup solutions have their own ability to do this immutability. So they can keep up. Just be aware of the methods that the threat actors use to attack. Now, and I'm talking about cybercrime here, cybercrime attackers, nation state APTs, advanced persistent threats, are another level of sophistication entirely. They are more concerned with espionage and data exfiltration than they are with outright destruction and ransoming of your information. So it's sort of two different use cases, but generally, nation state or not, having backups that are disconnected entirely from the network is always a good idea.
Thanks, Sean. So that brings up an interesting question. So, do you think cloud based backups are the best or on premises backups?
Well, certainly, and since we're talking about World Backup Day, this is not just for organizations. These are for individuals as well. I'm a big proponent of cloud-based backups for individuals because you get much more of that immutability, at least to an automated attack using cloud-based backups. Of course, each has their pros and cons, right? An obvious challenge with cloud-based backups is you have to have internet connectivity. But there are all kinds of immutability options for cloud-based backups and all kinds of storage options as well for cloud-based backups. And if you run into what I call geographically focused disasters, fires and hurricanes and that sort of thing, cloud solutions are marvelous because you don't have to worry about any particular location. And it gives you the ability to restore to any particular location. If you want to use the example for Active Directory, for example, is having backups in the cloud gives you the ability, if your on-prem environment has been laid waste by an attacker, they're still safe in the cloud. You could create domain controllers in your cloud service, depending on the sophistication of your backups. Certainly, again, coming back to being an identity person, there are distinct advantages to cloud-based backups, or actually to cloud-based restoration. One of my favorite scenarios that we get involved with at Semperis is the ability to back up your Active Directory on premises and restore it into the cloud, where you're not dependent upon the integrity of your on-premises systems that are under attack. So that gives you options at a time when you desperately need all the options you can get. So yeah, that's sort of where I'm thinking about it. It keeps going back to, you have to game out the different scenarios and then say, okay, well, in this scenario, what do we do for this? In that scenario, what do we do for that? And I'm a big fan of immutability, flexibility of recovery, and Active Directory has its own set of challenges for that because it's such a complicated distributed application. It's very difficult to do simple recoveries using the tools that Microsoft gave us.
So, Sean, while having a backup strategy is essential, securing backup data is equally important because attackers often target backup files to sabotage, enterprises' recovery efforts. So, what do you think are the best practices to ensure the backup is done correctly?
Well, more broadly, as we have discussed, immutability. Make sure that they can't get at it, and that includes, by the way, you may, again, this is what you learn from talking to red teamers. You may set immutable backups for your backup system, but if an administrator can change the retention period of those immutable backups, they're no longer immutable, because what the threat actor does is they go in and they find where the immutable backups are and they set the retention period to 0. They're gone. So I know one vendor that prefers to use the phrase indelible instead of immutable, meaning that once it's created, that's it. And this is actually, this is not new. It's not new strategy. The the acronym WORM, write once, read many, has been around for a long, long time, where it's storage that is written to, and then you can never undo it. That's what DVDs are when you would burn your own DVDs. So that's one aspect of it, certainly. The other is the ability to recover without malware. And this is the challenge, and I'm going back to identity systems again, is when you discover your identity system, your Active Directory or your Enter ID, but specifically Active Directory, has been compromised, you have two problems. The first is that almost certainly the domain controllers will have malware on there. And let's face it, if your security software had found the malware in the first place, you wouldn't be in this situation, right? So there's malware on there, and then you have to go hunt down and find it. And that cleans the domain controller. But again, the second challenge in this practicing for securing data and being able to recover securely, because we talk about backups. Backups are important. Recovery is more important. So you can take all the backups that you like, but it's really all about recovery. So it's about recovering, making sure that your domain controllers are malware free, and then also making sure that your environment is trustworthy. And this is where we get, as I was talking before, about identity forensics. Because at the end, what you want is this resilience, this assumption. The phrase "assumed breach" as being, I've seen it brought up again, but it's actually an old phrase, and I remember this way back when Microsoft came out. I can't even remember what the name of the technology was, but it was revolutionary at the time. And the same with Google, of course, is that to assume that the bad guys are already on your network. And so at that point, you have to assume that even if they are on your network, that you can still keep the business running and have this popular phrase now, operational resilience, still keep the business running even while you are fighting back or recovering your systems, to at least keep a portion of the business running. And to do that, one of those aspects is to have integrity in your identity system, as so much comes on top of that. And I mentioned before, the other aspect that is not as well recognized is you can disassociate your backups, but you also have to look down the stack at everything that the backups depend upon. Is it your storage network? Is it your virtualization infrastructure? Is it your actual virtualized networking? That I know an organization, their firewalls were all compromised because they used Active Directory to log into their firewalls as administrators. Those are the dependencies that you have to look for.
So let's come to larger enterprises versus the small and medium enterprises, Sean. So larger enterprises may have the resources to implement sophisticated backup strategies, but sometimes startups and small businesses often face budget and resource constraints. So what do you recommend? What strategies do you recommend for startups or small businesses that may have limited resources but still need strong backup solutions?
For small businesses, you use what there are, and for small businesses, there are some free-ish options by the major backup manufacturers. Windows Server Backup is always there, and it works. I would, and it is about taking the backups regularly, getting them off someplace safe, and maybe again, maybe this is a scheduled task that comes up and pops up a note that says, "Don't forget to copy the backup to your hard drive and take it home." It's it's not the most sophisticated thing, but it still gets the job done. In terms of, and there's a point to bring out here in terms of identity systems, in terms of Active Directory, and it's not as rough for excuse me, for a small business as it is for larger businesses, and that is that um, backups and backup lifetime works differently for Active Directory than it does for a file server or an application server. A file server, you can go back 6 months, 8 months, and recover it if you need to, and it will work. It'll have old data, but it will work. Because Active Directory as a distributed system is making hundreds or thousands of changes every day in the environment, the older the backups that you take, that you have with you, the less effective they are, because of the changes that are made within Active Directory and because of the additions of users, the deletions of users, the changes of groups, and all of that. So at the very least, you should be taking backups every day of Active Directory. And I would say, for a manageable strategy, take an offsite backup every week before you go home for the weekend. Take a backup of it. And I mean, you don't have to take it home and put it in a safe at your house. You just have to disconnect it from the network. Obviously, if you take it home, that'll protect it from physical danger. But in terms of risk assessment nowadays, and I think about this in terms of online passwords and maybe the password book that your aunt might have to keep her passwords. It's actually pretty safe nowadays because the threat actors are all going through the computers. So daily backups, and at least weekly, make sure that you have something that is offsite, which could be as simple as unplugging the USB drive that you backed it up to.
That makes a lot of sense, Sean. Another important aspect of backup and disaster recovery is compliance. Organizations must adhere to various industry standards and regulations. So, what compliance standards should enterprises be aware when implementing backup solutions? How can they ensure that these are met?
Well, certainly the one that comes to mind immediately for everybody is GDPR. So you have to keep GDPR and GDPR regulations in mind when you're handling the personal data of European Union citizens and any organizations that touch EU citizens. So, which is pretty much everybody in the world nowadays. There is the UK Data Protection Act of 2018, which complements GDPR and sets out a framework for data protection, specifically in the UK. And there's also ISO 27001, been around for a long time, applies worldwide, and it provides a framework for managing and protecting data. Those are some of the standards, the compliance standards. And then, of course, the other aspect of it is, for these standards, you can't just throw them out there. You have to audit against them and show that you're providing compliance to those standards by regular audits and maintaining documentation that shows that you've done these audits.
Yeah, Sean. So coming back to the backup strategy, having a backup strategy is one thing, but then ensuring it is working is a crisis another. So many companies fail to test their backup strategies. How often should organizations test their backup strategies, Sean?
Well, again, focusing on identity, it's a challenge. And organizations, at least around their Active Directory disaster recoveries, have historically neglected this. And it's really, I mean, I was involved with this directly for many years. It's kind of amazing that historically, Active Directory was ignored considering how critical it is in the infrastructure. And the reason is over the years, they found that AD just kind of keeps on going. But that was for geographic disasters. As I said, hurricanes, floods, fires, things like that. That's what data centers are created for. And if a data center went down, Active Directory just kept on going. And then when it came up, it went back to normal again. But cyber disasters are another story because they're network wide. They don't care about geography. And AD has proven itself to be quite vulnerable against those because it wasn't designed to protect against it. So what you have is the need to restore Active Directory in a disaster recovery drill. How do you do it? And traditionally, the way to do it is very resource intensive. You have to install a domain controller in your production environment and then take it offline and then take it to an isolated network, run a whole bunch of cleanup operations, add capacity, go through all of these steps as part of your disaster recovery drill. And it is very costly. And when I say costly, I mean in terms of resource time, people time. It takes a high degree of Active Directory skill to do it. You have to establish networks. You have to go through documentation. There's a lot of complications to it. And historically, it's fallen by the wayside. And what happens, as you imply, when a disaster happens, the people that are tasked with doing it really haven't done it because they're too busy maintaining all of it. So the ability to do that is critical. It's very helpful. For an example, Semperis has an Active Directory forest recovery solution that allows you to take a backup of Active Directory and restore it quite simply into an isolated environment, which makes a disaster recovery drill, I won't say effortless, but vastly easier, which means you can then test it on a quarterly basis instead of it turning into this complicated, onerous, manual 29-step manual exercise to recover the forest into an isolated environment. And as we both know, the more often you can practice this, then the more often I'm a martial artist of many years, and there's an old samurai saying is if you practice drawing the sword many times, you'll have less of a challenge to have to do it if you really do draw the sword. So practice when you actually find yourself in anger makes it much more efficient when you have to do it.
So it's clear that a strong backup strategy is crucial, but Sean, the cyber threats are still evolving. Can we ever be fully protected from potential future threats? Or is it just a game of staying on top?
My viewpoint on the evolving threats is pretty simple. And talking to a lot of people in incident response tends to bear this out. And I'm talking about cybercrime. I'm not talking about nation state. If you look at cybercrime, if you proceed backwards from their goals. Their goals are to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, with as little interference from law enforcement as possible, thus maximizing number one. to their glee, there's a universe of organizations out there that are relatively unprotected and haven't done the basics for security. And my colleagues in incident response tell me the majority, not all, but the majority of attacks that they see in the wild are very straightforward. Many of them are attacks where the code is literally pulled from GitHub and directed at an organization, and off they go because the security is so low. So it's what I call eat your vegetables. If you want to protect yourself against your average cybercrime, or if you want, let's say protect yourself. Let's say if you want to mitigate the risk posed by cybercrime actors, go look at your security basics for your identity system. There are, last September, the Five Eyes Security Alliance, Intelligence Alliance, so that is the alliance of the 5 English-speaking countries, Australia, New Zealand, United States, Canada, and the UK, published a guidance paper, a 75-page paper on the vulnerabilities presented by Active Directory and the 17 different common attacks that they have found threat actors using. And if you take the basics of tightening up your environment, there's such a universe of prey for the threat actors out there. If it's sufficiently hard, and I'm not saying this is a guarantee, but if your environment is sufficiently difficult to get into, there's a point where the threat actors say, this is taking too much time. I can make more money in the company next door that doesn't have these instead of me messing around with this to try to get past this. As I said, nation state is different. But the analogy I've used many times is it's like the bear when camping, right? If you're camping and a bear comes into the campground, you don't necessarily have to be faster than the bear. You just have to be faster than your other campers. So eat your vegetables. Do the security basics. Semperis offers a free community tool called Purple Knight that has I think now we have about 36,000 downloads of Purple Knight. And it's one of the security evaluation tools that is listed in that Five Eyes intelligence report that you should use to evaluate the security of your Active Directory and your Entra ID environment. Run Purple Knight. Doesn't take any privileges in the domain. It doesn't even take any privileges on the client. And it doesn't send anything to us. We don't see any of it. Run Purple Knight and it will generate about an 80-page report giving you a score, showing you your vulnerabilities from most critical to least critical. And it's formatted very nicely to be able to give to management to say, look, these are the things that we need to do to be able to secure our environment, the basics that we need to be able to do to secure our environment. Because if we don't, the threat actors will be able to go in this way as well. So that's my call to action. At the very least, is go download Purple Knight from Semperis. It's easy to find. And evaluate your security and look at the steps that you need to protect your Active Directory and associated with it, your backups and your recovery strategy.
Yeah, Sean. So before we wrap up, is there any final piece of advice you'd like to give us?
Eat your vegetables. It
I
it
mean, the
is
organizations to strengthen their backup and recovery strategies, perhaps an
well,
identical example like a bear, maybe.
yeah. It is. Go have engage. It's worth it. Engage some organization to red team your environment specifically aimed at backups. Find out how well and take these steps that I'm describing to you to protect your backup systems and the integrity of your backups as best you can. Then have somebody red team it and find out what they did to get in, and then iterate and close all of those holes. Because if the red team doesn't do it, and if you don't protect against that, the threat actors will, and the consequences are significantly higher.
Thank you so much, Sean. Thank you again for joining us today and providing us with such an in depth perspective on the importance of backup strategies, Sean. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I always look forward to the opportunity to talk about protecting identity because it's at the core of what we really need.
Thank you, Sean.